Good afternoon. I'm Marcia Connolly for the Association of Lifelong Learners. Welcome to today's presentation titled Sensing Greatness. And Patty DeDurr will be here with us to help us better understand Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Many of us know individuals with inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. Patty will better define symptoms of ADHD, discuss assessment and ways to find school accommodations. She will name and define the major learning disabilities and discuss tips to manage them, both as children and adults. She brings a vast experience. She was originally from Alpena, but now lives in Iowa with her husband and 2 children. And the children do have neurodiversities. And so Patty can speak to a very personal experience with all of these issues. She is a physical therapist assistant who is passionate about helping people with disabilities. She has written a children's book about ADHD, has a Facebook page, YouTube channel, podcast, and website, and has done numerous trainings on this topic. Welcome, Patty.
Hi, thanks for having me. This is the book that I wrote. It's called This Kid Can Hyper Focus. And on social media, you can find me under Sensing Greatness. I am neurodivergent myself. I have ADHD and dysgraphia, so I know about this too from personal experience myself. And neurodivergent, you may not have heard this term before, but someone that's neurodivergent is just their brain is wired differently. And if you look at this list of different neurodivergencies, you probably know one, if not multiple people that may fit under this umbrella. Sometimes people are born with this, and sometimes things like PTSD, which from trauma, they may become neurodivergent. And this is kind of like what society thinks about ADHD. They think it's overdiagnosed. They think it's not real. They think it's just hyperactivity. So this is kind of like some myths that, we'd like to bust, because this is not just truly what ADHD is about. Really, ADHD is impactful with people with their executive function skills, and executive function encompasses these 8 different skills. And these skill sets are things that are cognitive skills that we use every day. And it's important to know because children that are neurodivergent, and especially children, I should say, they need help learning these executive function skills. It's not something that necessarily is taught in school either. So something that they may need to learn. And how your brain is developed from your back to your front. And in children with ADHD, it's been shown that their brain develops a little bit slower. And your prefrontal cortex is where all this executive function skills are. And so they're going to be delayed a few years from their peers. So all these different executive function skills, are going to be more difficult for children that may have ADHD, and adults too. And I'll go into that a little bit more. So with adults, you may find a deficit in their dopamine and norepinephrine. And these 2 hormones really play an integral role in your executive function skills, as well, with working memory and impulsivity and things like that. And with these 2 neurotransmitters, some things that can help to regulate them is medicine. So that's things like stimulants, like the Adderall and Ritalin and things like that. And exercise, your sleeping habits, things like that can help to regulate these 2 neurotransmitters. So the first executive function skill is time management. And so this is just getting things, and what I have labeled here is just things that, how this may impact someone that has ADHD. These are some different deficits that you may find where they may be late to important events. Sometimes people may label them as unreliable. And another thing that a lot of people with ADHD have is something called time blindness, where they're not really good at saying, thinking about how long a task may take. And let's say they want to quickly clean the bathroom and think, oh, I can get this done in 5 minutes. And 30 minutes later, they're there still cleaning the bathroom because maybe they got distracted, or maybe they started to work on something else. They don't realize like how long certain tasks may take. So their time management skills may be deficient. And then you have impulse control. So that's like difficulty with resisting distractions. maybe you talk a lot in the classroom, like you're considered like the chatterbox in the classroom. I think a lot of girls that have ADHD are kind of labeled that. And you like overshare. So when you're talking to someone, you start really oversharing some information that maybe you don't need to overshare because maybe you just met this person and you're oversharing stuff that they're just like, that's a lot of information. I really just met you. And then you have working memory. And this is kind of an important one, especially with kids in school, because they're going to need these accommodations to help with working memory, because they're just not going to be able to have this kind of short-term memory that maybe some of their peers will have. So some accommodations could be helpful in school to help with this working memory. And if you go to my website, sensinggreatness.com, I have a huge list of executive functions, accommodations, and they're listed by each executive function skill. So people can look through that too. Maybe their grandkids have ADHD, maybe someone else they know, and they can look through that list to see what may be beneficial in school. And you can work on working memory by even stuff like playing board games, working on multi-step directions, and incorporating like a multi-sensory approach. So multi-sensory is things like making it tactile so you can touch it, making it visual, you see it, making it auditory so you can hear it. So making it a multi-sensory approach helps people to learn, to remember things as well. Oops. So flexible thinking is kind of your ability to kind of change directions of how you're maybe doing something. Like maybe you always go this certain way to your work, and now there's road construction, and sometimes people may be very they have a hard time. All of a sudden they have to change the way they're going. They have to maybe leave a little earlier, or just like changing ways of how they're currently doing things. Sometimes people have difficulty with that. You can have trouble with multitasking as well. And so just, with flexible thinking, it's important as a child is growing to let them be creative, letting them wear those mismatched socks, or practicing self-talk and self-regulation can help with that as well. So they can help to kind of like problem solve things themselves. So that self-talk helps them to kind of like look at the bigger picture and help them work through it on their own. Let me know if I'm going too fast or if anyone has any questions as well. So emotional regulation, can kind of be a big one. I think people see this a lot in the classroom as well, because they'll say little Johnny is getting really frustrated in class, or maybe your kids come home from school and they just, you can tell they're frustrated, or they just all of a sudden they blow up, or there's a lot of anger. So there's this big emotional regulation that is happening with kids, or adults, this happens to as well with ADHD, where they're just having a hard time with all these different emotions. There's something called masking, which if people are not familiar with, it's kind of where you're able to go through, like, let's say your class setting, you're able to go through your class setting and you're able to like kind of mask your emotions that you have, or you're able to mask that like you're having difficulty understanding the teacher, and you come home and you just like can finally take that mask off and just kind of like be yourself, and you just are so overwhelmed with the whole day, and you finally feel that you're at a safe place. So a lot of times just like, and you'll see this in some classrooms as well, where teachers will kind of just work through different emotions. They may have something where they just talk about emotions. They may have some type of class project where they will talk about different emotions that they have as well. Like, what should you do if you're sad? What should you do if you're angry? And so kids can kind of work through that with perhaps drawing pictures, or talking to their peers, or doing small group settings to kind of figure out what may work best for them. One thing with emotional regulation is sometimes kids may have difficulty asking for help. And so sometimes even in the classroom setting, like, they need help, but they're having difficulty asking for that help. So there's times where teachers could even incorporate this, like, it's like a yes/no chart. So they can move this paper clip. So if the child needs help, because sometimes kids aren't great about asking for help or raising their hands, there could be this yes/no clip, and the kid can just move it after the teacher gives the assignment to yes, I understand, or no, I don't understand. And so then when the teacher walks around, they can see that a kid has moved that paper clip. So then they're able to see like, oh, let me sit down and help this child, because that's how my son did it initially when he was in kindergarten or first grade. And now that he's going into high school, he's able to go and ask teachers for help, or he's able to go and raise his hand, because, you know, with accommodations in school, you kind of progress further and further. So maybe the hope is you don't need that accommodation as you go through school. And organization. So there's something called like a dooms box that people with ADHD have. So they'll have this box where it's be like a catch-all, and there'll be multiple places. Maybe like, think of like a junk drawer, but think of that in like places throughout your house. So it'll be this box, and like you don't know where this stuff goes. You just start putting in this box, and all of a sudden you look in this dooms box, and it's full of stuff maybe you're looking for, like that tape roll. Oh, how that tape roll get in there? Because you have this dooms box like all over your house. And then you have like, I think people with ADHD are always trying to find a way to organize stuff. And they're always trying to find, how can I organize this? And in their mind, they have this picture, and it doesn't always work out. And I think that's okay. And it's important to like, you know, work through your kid and do things like body doubling can help. So there's this, there's an app called Clubhouse, and there's groups on there that people will body doubling. And what body doubling is that you work with a group of people, or even just one person, and you set your intention. For 5 minutes, you talk about what your intention is for the next 25 minutes. And you say, my intention for the next 25 minutes is to organize and it doesn't be organized, it can be anything. It'd be organize the drawers under my sink. And like everyone talks about what they're going to do for the next 25 minutes. And then the room goes silent, and you work on that for 25 minutes. And then all of a sudden a little bird will chirp or something. Then you come back and regroup and talk about, how did you progress during that thing? Like, how did you do? Did you finish the stuff? And that's just a nice way to have someone there alongside you when they're really not. And this is a free app, and there's Focus Mates, and there's other free apps too. And it's a nice way to have other people around you, so you can like have that body doubling, because that's kind of something that's kind of important with ADHD. Okay, then self-monitoring. Let me get a drink of water really quick. Okay, for self-monitoring, a big thing with this one is self-care. A lot of times with self-monitoring, people want it to be more like, there's something called neurotypical, which is someone who's not neurodivergent. So this society, this school work, it's all built around this neurotypical society, which can be very hard for people who are neurodivergent. And so with self-monitoring, a lot of times there may be this idea from neurotypicals that we need to make this neurodivergent person, especially people who are autistic, we need to make this person more like us, who's neurotypical, which should not be the case. We just need to be more welcoming and accepting of people who have maybe different communication patterns, maybe different ideas. And instead of trying to make them into this little like brick, we're kind of like welcoming them and making the society more open to people who are neurodivergent. So with self-monitoring, I kind of focus more on self-care. And so that can be very hard for someone who has ADHD. They may need a lot of reminders, even to brush their teeth, take showers, things like that. In a couple of slides, I'm going to show you a little task thing that I have on my website that people can download to help with self-care. Another thing with self-care you can do is something called like habit stacking. So let's say you have a habit every day, you wake up and you eat breakfast. You do it automatically, like you don't even think about it. But now you can habit stack. So along with your breakfast, maybe you put your medicine there next to it. So all of a sudden you're eating your breakfast because you do that every day. You don't even think about it. And now you're habit stacking. So now you're taking your medicine with your breakfast. Or maybe every day you wake up, you obviously go to the bathroom. And so maybe you put your toothbrush and toothpaste next to that to remind you, like, after you go to the bathroom, go brush your teeth. And you kind of make this routine of habit stacking. It's also going to be good with self-care to make alarms on your phone. And so you set an alarm every day to go off at, let's say, 7 a.m. to brush teeth, take medicine. Or maybe you set an alarm to do, take the dog out. And so sometimes it's important to set these alarms to help kind of regulate your day as well. So task initiation, this is probably one of the most difficult things to do, because sometimes these tasks that we're giving can be so huge and so overwhelming that they really need to be broken down into smaller tasks to complete. Or even if someone is able to see like the bigger picture, like let's say for a classroom project, you are to draw a picture of what you did this weekend and think about maybe what you'd like to do next weekend. Well, that's multiple steps to do. So maybe if the teacher had like a final project of what that's to look like, it can help with kind of doing that as well. And I'm going to show you, here's some things that teachers and schools can do. But here's like the morning task one. I don't know if people on Zoom can see this, but it's pretty much just like a sheet, and it would say like morning on it, and it would break down like take your vitamins, brush teeth, and then the kids, they would have like, I have this laminated at home. So then the kids would have this sheet here, and you Velcro this up. So then this is closed. And then you Velcro the next one, and then it's closed. So then you close all these tabs, and when you're done with that routine. One of the easier ones to do is the bedroom, because when you tell the kids, go clean your bedroom, well, there's a lot to do when you clean your bedroom. It's not just like picking up stuff. So here's another task thing that can break it down. So it can be like clean under the bed and make the bed can be one. And then take stuff off the bookshelves and dust it could be another. And then you can break down all the tasks that pertain to their particular bedroom, and they can help them see like, okay, I do this first, and then I do this next. And so it can help them finish this task that seemed overwhelming at first, and now they're able to accomplish it. And this is another little thing I have on my site. It's just this executive function hack for chores, because chores can be so, I mean, there's not much reward there for your brain to feel really like I'm excited to do this. And so this is kind of like a little cheat. So in like a jar, these are on my website too. You can just cut these out, and you can just like pick one out of the jar, and it can be like, okay, this one says listen to music. So there's fun ones incorporated with ones like mop the kitchen floor. And so this can be a good one for kids too, is they can pick out what their chores are in this little chore jar that you would have. And one thing important with ADHD is it's estimated that around 80% of people with ADHD are diagnosed with at least one other comorbidity. And sometimes that can be something like a learning disability like dyslexia, or anxiety, depression, autism, and a lot more as well. Okay, before I go on to like some of the Ds, which is like dysgraphia, dyscalculia and stuff, does anyone have any questions about ADHD? Okay.
I noticed in the first page that you had schizophrenia up there. And a lot of times you'll become schizophrenic, or it doesn't really develop in your early teens, early 20s. Is it more common with ADHD or?
So the person's asking about schizophrenia and ADHD. I don't know the statistic about that, like what the correlation is between those two. It does seem to be more in your 20s and teens when you start realizing that you have this. But I'm not an expert in schizophrenia, so I have no idea what happens early in your childhood with it. So I'm not the best to answer that question, unfortunately.
The other question I had was, I know with my grandchildren and ADHD, that when I ask them a question about what they did that day, it's hard to know how to ask it or how to get them talking, because they like to give one word answers. They don't like to tell the story.
Yeah, I mean, that's common with any kids. And that, again, is your short-term memory too, trying to remember what happened that day. Like I have a hard time remembering what I had for supper yesterday. So even remembering what you did during the school day can be overwhelming. So a lot of times I'll just ask the kids, what did you eat for lunch today? Or what did you get for extras? Because at our school, we have these extras that the kid can pick. And so that gets them talking about like, and once they start talking about that, and then I start asking more specific questions about maybe the band class, how was that? Or what music are you working on, or stuff like that. So kind of start with like an easier question. If they like food, definitely ask them about extras if their school does that or something similar to that.
Should your question be more exact? You know, instead of open-ended question.
Oh, yeah.
That's something.
I think it's always a good idea to do open-ended questions instead of like a yes/no question. Unless if someone's using a communication device, they're called like alternative communication device, AAC, sometimes abbreviated. And those are more pictures where yes/no questions may be easier for people like that who may have a speech delay or may have selective mutism. And so they can use those devices to answer questions. So a lot of times those devices would just be like a big picture and it'd say like yes, no, and then have some keywords that they may use throughout the day. So sometimes using yes, no may be better, easier for that, but they can answer a multitude of questions. They're still speaking, they're still communicating. It just may be harder and longer and more frustrating depending on how new they are to that device to answer the question. Okay, I will move on. So I'm only gonna talk about like the D ones, which is like dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia. I think I'm missing one. I'll go through it though. But I also have dysgraphia. So this is writing difficulty. So when a lot of people think of a dysgraphia, they automatically think of fine motor skills, and you may be deficit of that, which certainly can be true for some people, but that's not the case for everyone who has dysgraphia. Sometimes people really can be helped with using keyboard typing, using speech to text, helping in like doing fill in the blank answers, doing sentence starters in classrooms. There's a lot of things that can help people who maybe have dysgraphia, because it's not just fine motor deficit. There can be a multitude of other things happening with dysgraphia. Okay, so dyspraxia, this is your motor skill deficit. So if I was to work, I do physical therapy for a living. So if I was to work with someone who has dyspraxia, we would work on kind of like their whole body, especially working on gait, which is their walking ability, because that's a big thing with dyspraxia. Working on, you know, vestibular rehab, so kind of like their balance is a big thing to work on as well with people who have dyspraxia. And it may be someone who bumps into furniture a lot, or let's say you bump into walls as you're walking in and out of rooms. That's something that's very common with people who have dyspraxia. You get tired very quickly as well, especially because your gross motor skills may be deficient if you have dyspraxia. And dyscalculia, this is having difficulty with math. So a lot of people who have dyscalculia, they may flip like addition and subtraction. So instead of like seeing a question on the board that says like 2 + 2 equals, they may in their brain think 2 - 2 and think it equals 0. So a lot of people who have dyscalculia, it's so great the last few years having calculators on our phone compared to when we were all younger. This wasn't a thing. And so having things like using a calculator and having that as an accommodation. There's also these math sheets that have easy the main math problems dealing with addition, subtraction, division, and multiplication. Having that in the classroom can be very, very beneficial as well, because you need those core things to go on to like the higher algebra classes and stuff. So it's not cheating having these math sheets or having a calculator with a child that may have dyscalculia or an adult that has dyscalculia, because when you have these disabilities, you have these for your whole life. You don't just have dyscalculia as a child, you're going to have this as an adult as well. So dysnomia, this one is having like a word retrieval struggle. So let's say that you have someone and they're asking, they can't think of the word for like fork. And so they, can you hand me this? And they're doing like the motion for it, or they say spoon, or they say like the wrong word for it. This is someone with dysnomia. My son, he was diagnosed with this when he was quite young. And we worked on a lot of different things with dysnomia. So word games, 20 questions, things like this can help develop those skills. So someone that has dysnomia, And when he did another test a couple years later, when they did the test for dysnomia, he found that he didn't have it anymore because he did so well with those tests, and he worked so much with his memory that he was able to kind of do well with the test for dysnomia. So things like in school, doing multiple choice instead of word essays can be very important for someone that may have dysnomia. And dyslexia is probably one that's more common of the ones I just mentioned. More people are familiar with dysnomia. So that's when a child is young, and you start seeing this in preschool and kindergarten, where they have difficulty with rhyming words, difficulty with nonsense words. When they read, they will sometimes skip like the word the or but or like words that really aren't needed in that sentence, they kind of skip. And you'll notice a lot too, if they read, they may, let's say, the cat smiled at me. And let's say there is a picture of, or let's say there's no picture, and they just see like the cat smiled at me. They may think the car smiled at me, because they don't always look at like the last words of the last letters of the words. They kind of just look at the full sentence itself. And so that's things with dyslexia. This is why it's so important for schools to start incorporating structured literacy instead of balanced literacy. Most school districts use balanced literacy, and this is why so many people in the dyslexia community want schools to start incorporating structured literacy and kind of do away with balanced literacy. So things like phonemic awareness and stuff like that is so important with people who are dyslexic. And I just want to thank everyone for their time. If people have any more questions about anything, feel free to let me know.
Tell us about your book.
Yes.
And how you came to write it.
Yep.
Process.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So this is my book, This Kid Can Hyperfocus. This came out last November, and the main character has ADHD. It kind of was written based on me and my son mainly. And I self-published, and I did something called a Kickstarter. So this is a way people can pre-order the book. So they were able to pre-order the book so I could raise funds in order to get the hardcover, because hardcovers can be expensive to get. And so once I got the Kickstarter funded, which was like $5,500, I think I raised, I was able to then get all these published. And I was able to fill the orders of people who pre-ordered. And now I still have some on hand that I sell at vendor fairs. And people can purchase them from Amazon. And there's other brick and mortar stores in Iowa that carry them as well. And I'll have another book coming out this fall that will be about the llama that's in the book that has dysgraphia. So that's kind of based more on like my dysgraphia and how keyboarding and typing helps. And so it's not really related to a little bit of core strength and fine motor skills it talks about, but it's mainly about accommodations, that book. And yeah.
Where does hyperfocus come into this whole discussion?
Yep. So hyperfocus is the ability, and you see this in people with ADHD, to really focus on something. So sometimes people, let's say kids, really can focus for hours on playing Legos. And the parents can be like, well, he doesn't have ADHD. He can focus for hours on playing Legos. And like, well, no, that's actually a trait of people with ADHD where they can focus on something for hours. So his hyperfocus mission in the book is to bring smiles to the other farm animals because it's been too quiet around the farm. So he goes along the book to all the different farm animals to make them smile again. And in the book, there's some typical ADHD things that he does, like he misplaces an item, he fidgets at one point, he gets a little nervous. So there's different things that happen along the way that are kind of like typical ADHD characteristics as well. Yes.
Is there medicine to help focus more, or is it mainly trained the parents professionally?
Oh, with ADHD, it's not medical advice, but people can certainly, there's a lot of studies that show that stimulants like Adderall do help. A lot of people do not, because they do help getting that dopamine and norepinephrine in your brain, because that's very important with your prefrontal cortex and some of those executive function skills, like I mentioned. But a lot of people do not want to take medicine, or some people are even self-diagnosed. which is very valid. I totally agree with being self-diagnosed, because getting an actual diagnosis, especially if you're a woman or a girl, can be very difficult and very expensive as well. And so there's other things, like I mentioned, doing appropriate amount of sleep, which can be very hard if you have ADHD. Also, exercise. There's a lot of studies that show that exercise, how important that is with people who do have ADHD.
I read somewhere where you think like motion sickness help with ADHD.
Well, so motion sickness medicine with ADHD, it helps your vestibular system, which there is, because that's your balance, or your vestibular system helps with your balance. So there are some things that have been shown that doing vestibular exercise can help with your ADHD symptoms. I know there was a study about motion sickness medicine. I don't know everything about the motion sickness medicine, but I do know it relates because that is affecting your vestibular system.
How did you go about the diagnosis for yourself and your son? Did you find a lot of readings about it, or did you speak to a professional about it?
So when I was diagnosed with ADHD, this would have been like 20 years ago. So back then you were given nothing. You were given a script for Ritalin, and I don't even think I was given a pamphlet. I was pretty much given nothing back 20 years ago. It's totally different now, because when my kids were diagnosed, they both were given this full evaluation sheet with accommodations that could be beneficial in school, as well as other things that may be beneficial. But neither of the diagnosis that my kids had talked anything about executive function skills, which I found very interesting, because I know other people who have went through the diagnosis process and they do have a whole executive function skill thing done to show where they're lacking, where they may need help, but neither of my kids had that done with their diagnosis.
So who diagnosed?
Typically a neuropsych is who would do a full diagnosis. Sometimes people can, for things like dyslexia and stuff, you can go to like a speech therapist can sometimes diagnose that. But if you want a full diagnosis, because many times with ADHD, there's other things like, I've shown other things that are going on as well. And sometimes people with ADHD may feel like they have ADHD and they may have something else. So it can be important to go to a neuropsych, because they would do a full eval, which again is very expensive. So it's sometimes very, yeah. Yeah, and I know for my kids, you're in like 6-month waiting list to even like get it. I know people in other countries, like I've talked to people in England, and to go through that process takes years sometimes. Like people just don't have that time, especially if you have a kid who has that diagnosis and you need those accommodations in school, you just don't have that time.
Do schools provide some sort of assessment?
You can go through the process at school. Schools typically won't assess. They may have a psychologist on their team, but they won't really assess. They may assess generically, like they may say there's like reading difficulty, or they may be very generic. And if they come back with the eval and you don't agree with the eval, you can say, I don't agree with this, and then you can go. And for my son, they did pay for a second eval for a neuropsych. But that you really have to have those deficits there in place to get the school to do that kind of like third party eval to really show what may be happening. But schools will start the assessment process, and that's where I would start as a parent. I would start with the assessment process with the school, put it in writing that you're looking to get an evaluation done. Then they have so long to kind of get back to you of where they're at in the process, because legally they do have to start the process with that. A lot of schools have been known to delay, and then it falls back on the parents. Sometimes parents will just go forward and just do their own eval because it's just taking so long to go through the school system. And your kids progressing through school, you need these accommodations. You don't have all this time just to wait for this to happen going through the school system.
Do you find that educators are open to your requests for assistance and then putting those types of ideas into the classroom to use them?
I would say back when we started this process 10 years ago, no, absolutely not. Nope. I would say more so now, teachers are more aware, and there's way more teachers that are now neurodivergent themselves. So I think that helps tremendously, especially these younger teachers that are coming in, realizing that they may have this. I talked to a teacher recently who just graduated, who is dyslexic, who's really excited to be a teacher and be that teacher for kids that she didn't have. So I think there's a big movement of being neurodivergent and becoming a teacher. So I think that's helping tremendously. But still higher at these admin levels are people who are typically just neurotypical and may not get why these accommodations are important. So that's why it's important to read things like Wright's Law. So it's WRIGHTSLAW. They put together this book that helps some keywords that may help you get these accommodations in place. Sure.
Watching all of this and listening, I can see myself in some of these things. I can see my grandson in some of these things, and the question is,
I don't, can you see
do we
that?
need to be concerned, or are they going through phases, or what's important to be able to follow through with?
Yeah, so Wright's Law is, that book would have a lot of stuff to go. So there's things like FAPE. So this is free appropriate public education, is this word FAPE. So every kid in the public school system is entitled to FAPE. And so using this keyword,
In all states.
yes, and all, it's a federal thing. So using this keyword in the email you put together, especially when you're requesting accommodations, this keyword is important. And also using IDEA, this keyword is important as well. So using, and this book will talk about these, using these two keywords in any email you put together will help, because they'll know, like, what you're talking about, and that these accommodations are important. And to be at level with your peers. So a lot of teachers so having full teacher notes as a student gets up in grades and you need those teacher notes is so important. And so many schools think that's cheating, when it's obviously not cheating. When you're having working memory difficulty, when you're having organization difficulty, getting full teacher notes helps you be at that level with your peers. So it's not cheating.
And some of the difficulty would probably come in making sure those are accurate notes.
Yes, yep.
They're not sidelining a child for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, especially if you have dysgraphia or dyslexia, you definitely need to have those full teacher notes, if not something called guided teacher note. So a guided teacher note is pretty much a teacher outline, and the student will just fill in the blank of keywords that may be needed. So that's something that as they get up, like in high school, using guided notes is something that they could do. Yeah, statistically speaking, they do show kids that are neurodivergent would be the ones who maybe aren't graduating or are getting into more trouble. If you look at, there was a study done at one of the Texas prison systems, and it showed like 70 to 80% of the inmates can't really read. That's a huge percent. So yeah. Doesn't mean they're dyslexic. There could be something else happening, but the chances are there could be something happening there with a learning disability. Anyone have any other questions? Yeah.
But I think it's the kind of information that most of us in our group, as grandparents, for instance, and even parents who watch kids struggle from time to time, we didn't necessarily know how to name these things.
Right.
Know what was happening. So this is very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and thankfully now, especially with social media and stuff, all these different diagnoses are becoming more and more aware, and the myths are being busted too. Because I think also for so long, people just didn't even think, oh, why are there so many more kids that are autistic than there used to be? Well, that's not really the case. We just are more aware of what the different characteristic traits are of someone that may have ADHD or maybe autistic or maybe dyslexic. We're just more aware of what those traits are than what people used to be.
Well, and probably those same kids earlier just learned to accommodate in
Yep.
fashion to get by under the radar,
Yep.
rather than being singled out all the time as a bad kid who didn't pay attention.
Yep. That's true. There's been shown correlation with people that have ADHD that have like an addictive personality because of those executive function skills that are lacking. So there has been shown that there can be correlation with people that being an addictive personality and having ADHD.
Well, this is going to be interesting. We're having a presentation on adverse childhood experiences soon. And I can't help but think that there's a lot of interconnection. Some of these items that I'm going to ask more about them too.
Yeah, there's this woman that made this video, and she talked about how her mom knew as a child she was autistic, but her mom never told her. And so she went through life just thinking, why am I so much different? Why is it harder for me to communicate? Why is all this happening? And then she realized years went on as an adulthood, her mom told her, oh, you were diagnosed as autistic when you were a child. And so sometimes parents are like, when do I tell my child they have ADHD? When do I tell my child they're dyslexic? Well, that's why books like this can be important, because they kind of show a character in a positive trait that has that diagnosis. So it can kind of be an opening dialogue to have with your child about you having that certain diagnosis. So there's lots of books out there about have different main characters with different diagnoses. So that's kind of a way to kind of open that conversation with that child.
So on your website or Facebook page, do you have a lot of different lists about reading resources for both kids and parents? Or?
On my website is mainly either my book or it's about accommodations or executive function resources I've created. So that's the main thing. For some of those other things, I would tell people to look at the company called Understood. So understood.org. There's also decoding dyslexia organizations that do a lot of grassroots movements as far as making different bills pass the legislator in each different state. Michigan has a decoding dyslexia. Every state has a decoding dyslexia. So they're the ones really in the grassroots. And just because your kid's not dyslexic, the bills they're passing are good for all kids, not just kids that are dyslexic. They're doing things to help all kids.
Tell us a little bit about when your kids in school have these issues. We talk to the teachers, formulate this plan, that they do accommodations for the child.
Oh, yeah. So well, they would start with asking for an evaluation. If they don't have already have a diagnosis, they would start with that, writing the email asking for an evaluation of their child. They can use something called the child fine law. So this is a good one too. I don't know. Here, let me erase this and put this up here. So it's called the child fine law. So legally, this is how each school is required to find children that may be deficient or not at their peer level. So you would use the child fine law when you're kind of starting the evaluating process as well. You can use that word to help kind of get into that stepping stone of getting those accommodations. And once they start that, sometimes teachers are open to doing accommodations even without the diagnosis because they see that kid may be struggling and be like, hey, we're going to start doing multiple choice tests instead of fill in the blank test, or we're going to start getting rid of the essay in his stuff, or we're going to look at doing typing as an accommodate as for him instead of him doing pen to paper. So there's some teachers will automatically do accommodations without meeting the IEP if they know that the child may be struggling too.
Are teachers receiving more training on this?
Unfortunately, not a lot of, this is why decoding dyslexia is so important. Many teaching programs, you're graduating without knowing anything about IEPs, without knowing anything about 504s, without having like 1 week where you talked about all these different disabilities. So they're graduating not knowing any of this stuff because so many of the schools are focused on their lesson plan and what that looks like, or talking about balanced literacy, when some focus should be on helping these struggling students.
So that child fine isn't necessarily the teachers identifying something.
No. No, you as a, they can use the child fine, but you as a parent, and this is why it's so hard because not everyone has a parent like this, you need to be the one to use that child find. There are schools who are good about finding the child that may be struggling, but a lot of times they may send them to like a resource room or like the reading specialist person, but the reading specialist person never has any, well, rarely has any education in dyslexia or structured literacy. Most of their training is in balanced literacy. Just so people know the difference, balanced literacy is guessing the word, looking at context clues like pictures, where structured literacy is decoding the word using phonemic awareness. So that's why it's so important to use that structured literacy versus balanced literacy, where they're just guessing what the word is or skipping the word if they don't know. They use that too in balanced literacy.
How is it, like, you recognize something like this in your grandchild, but the parent doesn't seem to notice it? How would a grandparent go about telling the parent, I think the child is?
So if you're a grandparent and you see your child may have some of this, I would think a good part would be maybe finding articles to send to them, videos even to send, something that's quick and to the point, not something that's like long and detailed. Like don't send them scientific studies unless they're like scientific studies. Like you can send me scientific studies, I'll read them, but like don't just send them like quick articles. Like understood.org has a lot of different good articles. Attitude magazine isn't just about ADHD, it has a lot of different articles about stuff too. Send the kid the book, yeah.
I can see where that'd be a problem. You might have one of the parents that. is
Yeah,
very
it happens,
good,
yep.
And the other parent says, no, not my kid.
Yeah, it can be hard because there's, I see a lot on Facebook groups where people say, my husband or my wife is having a difficulty with this. They don't think it's real. They think that the kid's just not giving everything. Like, so it can be really hard when one parent's not on board. So a lot of it can just be having to educate that person. And sometimes it's watching maybe movies that have a character like that or something like that, so they can see, oh, okay.
Because obviously it takes a lot of more time and attention to assist these children, both in school and at home.
Oh yeah, definitely.
You really have to have someone willing to advocate as well as participate in all the extra effort that
Yeah.
may be needed.
That's why it can be so important for parents to find that community. It doesn't have to be a community that's really in person. There are some support groups, but finding just like a Facebook group where it's similar parents, where maybe you can say, this is happening. And there's a lot of people that have really great advice in those different groups.
Well, again, you provided a lot of information. Have to go on and watch it again.
I know. I talk kind of fast sometimes too.
But you covered a lot of good information.
Yeah.
My daughter.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I appreciate it. Yeah.
On your vacation.
Yeah.